Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Better Health Speaker Series. Welcome back for a lot of you, and welcome to some of the new faces. I'm Matthew Strang, and I work here at the Institute, and I'm so excited for today's talk and hear from our wonderful speaker. I heard that many of you are curious about what an ecological model is and how that fits in with resilience. And I too, when I first met our speaker, was curious. I knew what ecological was, I knew what a model was, and I was like, okay, when you put those together into a health environment, what exactly does that mean? And it's one of the reasons that I really wanted her to come to speak to us and share her knowledge with us. So I want to start off today, the introduction, with asking you all a question, something to think about. When you woke up this morning, did you listen to the rain? Did you hear it? Did it make you smile? Did it make you frown? Thinking ecologically and something like defining what ecological is, it's the relating or concerned with the relation of living organisms to one another and to their physical surroundings. So it's really about relationships amongst each other and our environment, right? And this is what our speaker today does. She thinks about this, she researches it, and then she implements it. And so we're really fortunate to have her here to talk to us about this and to share her expertise. Dr. Andrea Frolic is the director of both the Office of Clinical and Organizational Ethics and of the Medical Assistance in Dying program that are both located at the Hamilton Health Sciences. She's also assistant professor in the Department of Family Medicine at MAC, and she has a PhD in cultural anthropology from Rice University in Houston. And I also did a 2-year fellowship in clinical ethics at the University of Texas, and which is specifically in a cancer center. And I don't want to say too much about Andrea's many areas of expertise, but she really is a leading force here in Ontario in thinking about these things. And so I think it's really important for us to hear what she has to say, because we work in a similar kind of environment, and us to sort of see how might you do this, and maybe not even how might do it, but how might begin to think about it. So please thank me in welcoming Dr. Andrea Frolic to our speaker series.
It's good to be here with all of you this afternoon. Thanks for making time. It would be helpful if I could just get a sense of who's in the audience. So how many of you are healthcare professionals? So are most of you researchers? Okay, so that's not what I was expecting, but that's okay, because all of you have a role to play in the cultivation of ecologies of resilience for the healthcare professionals that you support. And you might be more on that outer ring of the ecology in terms of how to support our clinicians who are at the front line and really in the line of fire in terms of engaging with patients and families in their experiences of loss and suffering. So I encourage you to take what I'm about to say, to heart in terms of how it speaks to you. But I think it's really important for those of us who are somewhat removed from the frontline practice of healthcare to be very aware of the incredible cost of caring that healthcare professionals bear. And we have very little by way of organizational or workplace structures and supports to enable resilience of those clinicians in an integrated way. And it's really the integrated, connected, and ecological dimensions of resilience that I'm most concerned about. So I'm going to talk a bit about that and what we're doing in terms of trying to drive this model of practice into how we transform the healthcare system at Hamilton Health Sciences, how we transform how we think about our research into clinical services, and how we design and deliver clinical services. So I hope you find some relevance in it today. I want to recognize the incredible folk that I work with. Everything I'm about to tell you today is not mine alone. It has been created through the incredible brilliance and generosity of a whole team of people and with funding from the AMS Phoenix Fellowship, which I had from 2015 to 2018. I want to specifically acknowledge Kirsten Krull, who's the VP of Quality and Performance. She's my boss. She is the most brave and brilliant person I've ever worked for. I consider her a mentor and an inspiration to me. Diana Tikich is a resilience integration facilitator who now works in my office, and Marilyn Swinton is our research coordinator. And I'm going to be talking a bit about the design of our Medical Assistance in Dying program, which we call the Assisted Dying Resource and Assessment Service. And it's an example of how we're bringing to life this ecological model in a particularly high-risk clinical service and environment. So there are many, many threats to the provision of compassionate care these days. Our patients and families expect compassionate care. They don't just expect technically proficient care. They don't, in fact, technically flawless care is often what patients and families expect. They don't just expect that it's safe care and competent care and that it meets best practices. What patients and families tell us is that their experience matters, and their experience is largely mediated through the human bodies, minds, and hearts of the care providers at their bedside. It doesn't actually matter if you have the best possible technology, a robotic OR suite, or the best possible, drug delivery system. If the people at the bedside delivering that care and connecting directly with the patient and family are exhausted, disconnected, disassociated, distracted, burned out, they not only will deliver unsafe care, but the patient experience of that care will be enormously impacted. What patients and families all over the world, certainly you know this from the Barrel Institute and from your picker surveys or your engagement surveys, what patients and families want to just feel like they're seen, that they're heard, and that they matter. And the only way to make patients and families feel that way is by having a present and heartful clinician at their side, making them feel seen and heard and like they matter. But there are incredible barriers to providing this kind of presence in clinical care these days. Workload, overload, hallway medicine, unclear roles and responsibilities, multitasking, and in a physical environment that is full of distraction and noise. If you go onto, I don't know how often you guys will walk onto a medicine unit, it is cacophonous. There are alarms going off all the time. There are patients crying out. It's a very difficult auditory and visual and sensory environment to be present in. But what families and patients tell us is that what they expect is for us to be the rock in the raging river. When I'm at the bedside of a patient, I'm a direct care provider with the Medical Assistance in Dying program. I support patients and families directly as a clinician. What they expect of me is that I arrive with my full attention on them, and that I am expected to, in fact, support them to be in the midst of the chaos of their experience of living and dying, that they look to me to be that island of support, of safety, of care, and stability. So the question is, are we creating care environments that make this possible for our healthcare providers? Or do we create care environments that clinicians are constantly swimming against a current? And in fact, many clinicians are being swept away. When I was trained as a bioethicist, I was taught this thing called therapeutic distancing. I don't know if any of you know what therapeutic distancing is. Therapeutic distancing is the idea that I'm going to be with a patient who's dying, or a family member who's grieving, or a patient who might have lost the use of their legs, or had a stroke, has had a catastrophic change in their experience of living. And my job is to not react to that, and to hold that patient's suffering at a distance so that it doesn't impact me. And so that I can go on to the next patient and the next patient and the next patient. It actually doesn't work. Neurophysiologically, humans have these things called mirror neurons. It's right here. The very sort of most evolved part of the human brain is the prefrontal cortex. The mirror neurons are right here between our eyebrows. This is the part of the brain that has evolved to be able to see inside another human being and detect what their emotion is, to detect something about their inner life world, and not only to detect it, but to feel it in yourself. So you know this happens all the time. You watch a movie and you cry because something sad is happening on the screen. It's not happening to you. You in fact know that it's a fantasy. But nevertheless, your mirror neurons are activated and you feel inside yourself the sorrow or the loss of that actor, not even a real human, actor on the screen. That's because your mirror neurons are active. And all day long, if you're in a clinical practice, your mirror neurons are being activated by the suffering and death and loss that you are interacting with all day long. But we were taught, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that therapeutic distancing would protect us. If I just pretended like I had a force field around me, that I could protect myself from the experience of trauma, of bearing witness to the losses of my patients. And it's actually a lie. And what we know now is this beautiful quote from Rachel Naomi Remen. The expectation we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. And we know this now because we understand the neurophysiology of empathy and compassion and attachment, which we didn't know 20 and 30 years ago when we were taught therapeutic distancing. But I can for sure tell you that you have medical residents in this building, next door let's say, who are being taught the technique of therapeutic distancing. And then who are being made to feel like they're failures if they go home and cry at the end of the day. I actually had an oncologist in my office about 3 weeks ago who's considering leaving oncology. It took her 20 years to train to be a subspecialist. And she's considering leaving the field entirely because a colleague told her that she should stop crying when her patients die. The patients she sees are young women in their 30s and 40s, often leaving behind young children. She was told by a colleague, it literally gives me goosebumps, she was told by a colleague she wasn't cut out for oncology if she grieved her patients. These are the kinds of messages that are given to healthcare providers all the time. From the time we are trained and all the way through this kind of, I would say, psychological bullying that happens from peer to peer, and the expectations we have that we just suck it up and we arm ourselves and we disassociate from our experiences of loss and grief in our clinical practice. I've been very concerned about the psychological safety and impacts on healthcare providers of bearing witness to suffering for over 10 years. So what I did is I got trained as a mindfulness practitioner and a mindfulness teacher, and we've taught at Hamilton Health Sciences, we've taught over 2,000 healthcare providers in mindfulness-based interventions. And over the last 10 years, I've been doing research on the longitudinal impacts of these interventions on healthcare providers, and we find there are enormous benefits, even like 5, 6, 7 years after they took the single course. Mindfulness teaches people to be present, to open-heartedly have a sense of non-judgment of themselves and the situation. They're able to reset their stress response system in order to then be able to recalibrate and then go into the next situation with more awareness and presence and concentration and focus. People talk about increased sense of meaning and purpose and an increased ability to really connect empathically and compassionately with the people around them, their patients, their families, their colleagues, and their learners. So we know that mindfulness, and mindfulness is one of the most studied psychological interventions ever. Like thousands of peer-reviewed journal articles on the impacts of positive impacts of mindfulness on attention, on mental health, on physical health, on well-being, on social relationships. The evidence is totally irrefutable. In healthcare, we are very, very slow to actually take up this evidence into our practice. But one of the challenges is that despite all of these really important benefits that we've seen and that is in the literature, we know how powerful mindfulness is. This is an artist's rendition of the results of the research where clinicians tell us that engaging in mindfulness practice is like coming to an oasis. that they're able to reflect, they're able to pause, they're able to ground, they're able to connect with their environment in a much more wholesome way, and they're able to feel sheltered. Especially in a chaotic environment, they're able to feel sheltered within themselves. But one of the problems is that we expect people to do these kinds of self-care practices outside of work. But the evidence doesn't support the fact that doing self-care will actually protect you from negative psychological sequelae of working in a high trauma environment. It doesn't actually matter how many yoga classes you take or how much meditation you do outside of work. It's super good for you. Like, please meditate, please do yoga, please run, please exercise, please eat well, please sleep. This is not protective against the psychological sequelae of trauma exposure in the workplace. It can help you, but it is not protective. And my question is, if we have all of this infrastructure, like to prevent needle sticks, to prevent ergonomic injuries by having lifts, we have protective equipment to protect clinicians from infection. Why have we never developed integrated structures and systems to protect healthcare providers from the known psychological hazards of their work? We don't do that. Why? Because we think it's their fault. If only you were stronger, if only you had better self-care, you wouldn't feel burned out. You wouldn't be impacted by your patient's death. You wouldn't lose hope and go home and drink a bottle of Merlot after every shift. 1 in 10 healthcare providers has a serious addiction. And that is not their fault. That's because what they're doing is numbing themselves from the psychological hazards that they are experiencing in their workplace, that we give no space to in the course of their work. And we also know the rates of suicidality and suicide in residents and physicians and other health professionals is many times the rate of the average citizen. So we are losing talent, and we are losing our colleagues to mental illness and to death. We had 2 resident suicide last year, and it's almost irrecoverable how you imagine the long-term loss to our society of that talent. So what we need to begin to really recognize is that the healthcare environment has very specific stressors. So all workplaces have stressors that are on the left: job stress, harassment or toxic relationships, and burnout. Burnout is simply overload. All workplaces can experience overload. A bank teller can experience this, a concierge, a public school teacher. All workplaces can experience burnout. But when you work a high-stress, high-trauma environment, you have additional stresses related to being subject to direct trauma. So I had one of my best friends at work physically assaulted by a psychiatric patient on Monday, and he's off work for the week. So you have the risk of being physically traumatized in the workplace or experience indirect trauma by bearing witness to suffering or hearing stories of suffering. This is very specific to helping professionals. And by helping professionals, I don't just mean healthcare, I mean EMS, I mean police, I mean many public school teachers who are on the front lines of providing like trauma-informed education in our systems. So anyone of course all the people who work in our community and home care. What happens, and what our bodies are conditioned to do, is when we experience a trauma or we experience something that is stressful, we go into this fight, flight, freeze response, right? Our amygdala fires, which is this very ancient part of the brain that we share with reptiles and fish and birds. This very ancient part of the brain floods our body with stress hormone, and it allows us to either fight for our survival or to flee. But the problem is, if you're a healthcare provider, you can't either hit your patient or run away from them. And so you'll get fired for both, appropriately so. And so what happens is these stress hormones just keep recirculating and recirculating in your tissues because there's no way for your body to expend that energy. You just have to literally take a breath and suck it up and figure out a way to reset. But the problem is, over the course, our bodies were evolved, and evolution goes very slowly, but civilization changes very rapidly. So we have a body that's designed for the savanna. We have a body that's designed to respond to large predatory attacks, which would happen, from saber-toothed tigers or lions or whatever. And, that we, on the savanna, our fight or flight freeze response would only be triggered maybe a few times a day at most. And then we would have time to come back to homeostasis and chill out and be with our people, take care of each other, relax, take a nap, eat something, and then go back. But what happens is, in our civilization now, our fight, flight, freeze response is triggered 50 to 60 times a day. There is no recovery. So that means, and if you ever walk onto a medicine unit and you just spend a little time walking alongside a nurse, you'll feel that her stress or his stress response is being triggered almost constantly. Because a patient is crying out, a patient is lashing out, a family is angry, a colleague is snippy, right? All day long they're getting dosed with these stress response with almost no time of recovery. Because what do we do when we're overloaded? We cut out breaks, we cut out time to relate, nobody gets lunch, and they take away the staff room and they put a patient in that room because we're so overloaded, which means staff don't even have a safe place to decompress for themselves and with each other. And what happens over time is that the brain actually starts to change structurally when we're in this constant experience of fight and flight. So the amygdala actually gets larger, and the front part of the brain starts to shrink. Your brain actually structurally changes based on the experiences that it's had, because of this thing called neuroplasticity, where your brain is changing all the time, based on what it thinks about and based on what it's exposed to. The prefrontal cortex, which is here at the front of the brain, is it's the latest part of the brain, human brain, to be evolved. It's the part of the brain that makes us human. It's the part of the brain that is responsible for empathy, compassion, attachment and connection to others. It's responsible for self-regulation, the ability to really regulate one's own response to situations, to regulate one's own emotional response. It's the part of the brain that helps us to integrate all different kinds of information to help create a story. And it's the part of the brain responsible for moral decision-making. So as an ethicist, this matters a lot to me. Because moral decision-making doesn't just happen out in the world. It happens in our bodies. Everything that we do happens in our bodies. And moral decision-making happens in this part of the body. So for me, I'm really concerned about the prefrontal cortex being online and strong and activated in our healthcare providers and our leaders. But what happens when the amygdala is firing? Literally, the prefrontal cortex cuts off. You can put someone in a functional MRI machine and you watch their synapses fire. And as soon as you subject that subject to stress, the amygdala fires and the prefrontal cortex goes quiet. So that means at the very moment a patient is activated, their behavior is escalating. At that very moment, what you most need are the resources of your prefrontal cortex. You need to be calm. You need to be connected. You need to see this person is suffering. And you need to have good decision making. But if you're dosed with these stress hormones, it's the part of the brain that cuts off because your body is just concerned about your own survival. And what's really interesting is that we don't teach any healthcare provider about this process. We just expect them to know. And we don't create structures that are protective of the prefrontal cortex. So that's what we're trying to do. This is a beautiful model called the WTF model on purpose. My friend Diana Tickich and I use this all the time. WTF! Where are you in your WTF? So ideally, stress is not a bad thing. We need stress to learn, to be challenged, to think, to grow. Humans that don't have stress actually don't thrive. That's why kids who are helicopter parented do really poorly in post-secondary education and in their lives, because you actually cultivate resilience by overcoming challenges. And if children never experience challenges, then they feel a sense of incompetence in themselves, and they actually don't thrive. So we need stress. But ideally, our stress zone stays in this kind of green zone. And we don't go up here to fight, flight, freeze, where we're panicked and agitated or obsessive or angry, or we have these racing thoughts, or we have a lot of anxiety. That means we've popped out into hyper-arousal of our stress response system. Or sometimes you'll see people in hypo-arousal, which means here, down here. They have no energy, they can't think, they feel depressed or passive or numb, they're helpless, and I see a ton of healthcare providers who are disassociated. And people think they're tough, but they're not tough. They're disassociated. Nothing phases them. They have no reaction to anything. The building could be burning down. They would have no response. Those people are the ones I worry most about. The nurse who cries after losing a patient, I actually don't worry about that nurse so much because she still has access to her heart and to her prefrontal cortex, and tears are in fact the parasympathetic nervous system trying to calm the stress response. Tears are a fantastic way to reset our stress response. It's the people who have no response that I think are most at risk. And we see this all the time. People pasting on a happy face. They're just getting through the day. They're just pasting it on. And guess what? Because patients and families have mirror neurons too, they can tell when you're disassociated. They can tell when you're faking it. They feel your disconnection. They feel your indifference. And that's the thing about mirror neurons. We can't fake it and they can't fake it. And so that's why having practices that really help to cultivate the capacity to overcome and return to the stress response and return to our window of tolerance is really important. So these are some terms that have evolved in the literature over the past 10 years to describe the psychological work hazards of caring professions. So trauma exposure is the direct and indirect exposure to events that could be perceived as traumatic, and that will be dependent upon every individual. Some people really love the blood and gore and guts of the ED, like they just feel a sense of energy and competence in that environment, and for other people it would be completely traumatizing. I have ED physicians I know who can literally hold a human heart beating in their hand and like squeeze it, and they're like, oh, that was a good day at work. But if you ask a psychiatric patient to describe, their experience of domestic violence, they completely lose their minds, right? So it is so individual and dependent, and that's why knowing ourselves and our own material is so important. But what's important is that it's this experience of loss or suffering or this evocation of feelings of helplessness and hopelessness that are really so challenging. Secondary traumatic stress is about bearing witness. You don't experience the primary trauma yourself, but you're bearing witness to traumatic events, and it can have, because of our mirror neurons, the same physiological effect on the body, and therefore can actually lead to post-traumatic stress, as if you were the person experiencing it directly. Vicarious trauma is a more cumulative form of trauma, where after hearing story after story after story of suffering, it really affects both the psychological and cognitive health of the practitioner. Burnout is endemic across all different fields. It's not specific to healthcare, but it certainly is one that we see a lot because of the overwhelming environmental demands. And moral distress occurs when helpers are forced to behave in ways that they know are against their values. And this happens, again, all the time. They're told to discharge a patient to an unsafe environment. They're told this patient has to wait even though they are becoming critically ill. And they don't have the right structures of support around them. So this is a Venn diagram that sort of talks about the various forms of known and predicted psychological workplace hazards and the psychological sequelae of helping work. These are considered to be endemic. They are a natural consequence of doing their work. It is not anybody's fault that they experience any or all of these psychological sequelae. We don't blame a nurse for a back injury if a patient was falling and the nurse caught the patient before they fell to the ground. We don't blame the nurse for that. We don't blame the nurse for a needle stick injury if there wasn't the right equipment around. But we have this very blaming and shaming environment in healthcare around the psychological sequelae of workplace hazards. So leave in 2018. After 20 years of clinical practice, seeing some of the worst possible experiences of suffering and loss, I really needed to step back and say, how do I create a more sustainable work environment for myself? So, and this is a quote, that when I came back to work, I was gone for 4 weeks, and then when I came back to work, I met this friend in the elevator, and she said this quote to me, "Until you decide to help yourself, nothing will change for you." And if any of you or people you love feel like this, please give them this message. It is not their fault and they are not alone, but you have to decide to help yourself. So what we're doing at Hamilton Health Sciences is to create an integrated resilience strategy so that people don't have to suffer on their own with the sequelae of being a caregiver, and people don't have to feel like they're failing at self-care if in fact they are impacted by the suffering and trauma of their work. So I want to spend a minute talking about what we mean by resilience. Resilience is the strength and speed of one's positive adaptation to adversity and the capacity to persevere. It requires a conscious choice to survive and to cope and to make things turn out well. And it's an internal growth process and the ability to make meaning and be stronger and burn brighter after an adverse event. Resilience is not about bouncing back. We are not rubber balls. We don't bounce back from a difficult experience or trauma, but what we can do is metabolize that experience, make meaning of it, and grow through it. And so that's what we really mean by resilience. We can't protect people from trauma. I run a medical assistance in dying program. I'm not going to stop seeing patients die. I can't change the fact that people die. I don't wish to change the fact that people die. But what I want to do is create structures and systems that allow myself and everyone touched by my program to be able to be resilient through these experiences. And the good thing is that just like cynicism is catching, right? Sometimes you walk into entire departments and the whole place is infected. It's like the flu. The whole place is infected with cynicism because, again, we have mirror neurons and we mirror each other's feelings and experiences and interpretations of the world, but resilience is also catching. So we want to make resilience as catching as the flu. I really like this metaphor of the flame, which we use a lot, because there are these things in the environment that dampen the flame or can cause our resilience to come out, like systematic marginalization or workload or changes in the environment, lack of control, trauma, an unsupportive work culture, or a sense of isolation. But there are also these things that can fuel, like our resources and social supports, our capacity to experience awareness, etc. So what we're trying to do is to take this neuroscientific literature and the psychological literature on the longitudinal impacts of exposure to suffering and loss and trauma in workplaces and create an ecology of resilience within the healthcare system at Hamilton Health Sciences. So just like we have an individual member of a species that belongs to a herd, and then they belong to a larger system with other, species there with them, and then this wider ecology, and then to the greatest extent the biome and the biosphere. This is how we conceptualize resilience now. Yes, there is the individual, but there's the team and the manager around that individual that have huge influence on the experience. We have the culture, the system, and the structure around that individual, and all of this is nested in our neurobiology. Again, it is through the body that care is mediated. It is through the body that meaning is mediated. It is through the body that health and healing is mediated. And so really to recognize the neurobiological influences on all of these three levels. This is a painting painted by my friend Rick Zazaluk. And this is a lot how, especially in the early days of this practice, medical assistance in dying felt. And it still feels like this to me. We're holding this patient, but we're also holding ourselves and their suffering impacts us. And so what we've done in the Medical Assistance in Dying program is to really develop and to integrate this ecological model. So first, at that organizational and structural level, we've built in protective features for our healthcare providers structurally. And so we've used this Pat Fisher model of organizational health. So we spend a lot of focus on developing leadership and succession planning. Succession planning means that we have the right people doing the right work at the right time. And we focus a lot of on our employee health. We have a dedicated psychotherapist for our assisted dying team, actually. Because we were noticing that people were having a lot of complex grief after some of their losses. We spend a lot of time in team and in community, communicating with each other, building trust, making sure that we have balance. We offer continuing professional development and education. We have a coherent vision of why we're here and what we're doing. And we really recognize each other's strengths. We make sure that our focus and our teamwork is adaptable and that we foster commitment and a sense of teamwork. So we've built these structures into how the program runs. And we have a 0 dropout rate. No one in the last 4 years has left our team because they feel so enlivened and so supported by the structures. We spend a lot of time building community. And you're like, who has time for that? But who has time for a colleague to go off work? Who has time to replace that colleague because they leave the profession? Nobody has time. Who has time, to pick up the work of someone who is perpetually calling in sick because they're so stressed by their work? It is a myth that we don't have time. And in fact, we're paying the cost of that now because we've stripped out social support, we've stripped out any kind of connective. Even team meetings happen virtually. We don't see each other face to face anymore, so we don't build trust with each other. A lack of trust is incredibly costly and it's very inefficient. And then we also, of course, want to make sure that we're encouraging people to do individual resilience practices, which we know are evidence informed. So things like mindfulness-based practices, using debriefing models and encouraging social supports within clinical practice, encouraging people to practice gratitude and to really recognize and sink into the things about the work that they love, making sure people are taking care of their physical health and constantly connecting to meaning and purpose. Connecting and healing and feeling like you're doing good for another person, it releases oxytocin, which is that tend and befriend, or that attachment hormone. It's the counterbalance to cortisol. And in fact, we have the opportunity to constantly dose ourselves with oxytocin when we're engaged in social relationships with each other and with patients and families, if we're able to be present and heartful and really feel connected and a sense of compassion and meaning and purpose. So again, we can use the resources of the body and actually use that in order to support our resilience. So the idea is that, that healthcare provider might be in the center, but we have these layers. We don't isolate them or make them feel alone in the trauma that they're exposed to, but we really create layer upon layer of support in order to enable their thriving, and by enabling their thriving, enabling the thriving of patients and families. The evidence is becoming irrefutable. When healthcare providers are exhausted, burnout, or distracted, infection rates are higher, errors are higher, mortality rates are higher, people die. Patients die because healthcare providers are exhausted and don't have the supports they need in their work environment to be safe, well, and present. And so that's why we think of the well-being of clinicians to be the other side of the coin of the well-being of patients. If I am well as a clinician, it is much more likely my patient will be well and have a good day. And so really saying that, we always talk about patients first, but we need to talk about patients and providers first. They are both first. They both need to be held and supported because otherwise our healthcare colleagues are going to become patients themselves. So what I really love about this photo is a photo that I took canoeing in Algonquin. And this reminds me of the Thich Nhat Hanh saying, no mud, no lotus. It's out of the mud and muck of life that we have our greatest lessons. Like, think about an enormous challenge you faced, maybe a breakup of a relationship or moving to a different city or getting fired or leaving a job or whatever. where it's in that mud and muck that over time, as you recovered and gained perspective and learned through that process, it became a silver lining. It maybe more insight, more meaning, more clarity, more wisdom emerged from that mud. That's the lotus that grows out of the mud. And I think what we really recognize is healthcare providers trained. They love being in the face of suffering, loss, and death. They love leaning into these challenging stories to heal where they can their patients and families. But do we create the right ecology for the lotus to really blossom? Or do we leave our patients and families and our colleagues under the water in the muck? And that's why I'm really committed to this idea of an ecology of care. So we can stop with the whole discourse of blaming and shaming health providers who are impacted by the psychological hazards of their workplace, and really embrace this idea that we're all in this together. So that's what we're doing at Hamilton Health Sciences. I can talk a little bit in the question period about the other programs that we're using this kind of ecological design in order to integrate resilience. But my time is up, so I'm just happy to pause and take questions, and thanks so much for your attention.